Hello everybody, welcome to Unit 3 Biology Area Study 2. Today we are looking at cellular respiration. So there is another video very similar to this one based on the previous study design that can be found earlier on my channel from 2020. This is an updated version, but it still basically has the same information. If you'd like another sort of rerun through this, you can have a look at that video as well. But basically what we're going to be covering today is looking at the inputs and the outputs of the 3 stages of respiration. We'll be looking at the location and the difference in outputs and inputs of aerobic fermentation, and we'll be looking at the factors that affect the rate of cellular respiration as well. So we'll start off with where this is happening and sort of an overview. So looking at aerobic cellular respiration, that involves 3 major stages, and that is glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. Now, each of these 3 stages are happening in slightly different places, okay? So the first stage is in the cytosol of the cell, okay? Whereas the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain are happening in the mitochondria. So we may have heard of the mitochondria as being the powerhouse of the cell because this is where our ATP is being created. So the Krebs cycle occurs in what we call the mitochondrial matrix, which is sort of this inner part, okay, this blue part here. And then the electron transport chain is happening on what we call the cristae of the mitochondria, which is sort of the membrane, this yellow outlining part that you can see as well. Okay, so the structure of the mitochondria and the locations of where these stages are happening. Now, in terms of aerobic respiration, it involves all 3 of these stages, okay? As long as oxygen is present, these 3 stages will occur. Anaerobic respiration, which we'll look at a little bit later, basically is glycolysis happens as normal, but then this pyruvate, okay, and this NADH won't go into the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. There will be another pathway that will be followed, and that's what this sort of blacked out part looks like. So what we're going to focus on with aerobic is all 3 of these stages occurring. So we'll start off with the first stage, glycolysis, happening in the cytosol. Basically, the inputs that we need to know is an input of glucose, and then that glucose is being split into what we call pyruvate, okay? There's 2 pyruvate molecules that this is being split into, and pyruvate is going to be used in the next stage. So it's actually an output of glycolysis. This process itself can happen with or without oxygen. And at the end of the first stage of cellular respiration, so at the end of glycolysis, we end up with 2 molecules of ATP. So you can see here, we've got our input of glucose, we've got an output of 2 ATP, we've also got an output of 2 NADH, and that 2 pyruvate. Now these 2 pyruvate are going to be an input for the Krebs cycle. So the Krebs cycle occurring in the inner matrix of the mitochondria. This process is also called the Krebs cycle. So those pyruvate are going to enter the mitochondria, and they're going to result in an output of 2 ATP, 6 carbon dioxide molecules, and some NADH as well. Okay, so this Krebs cycle process can also be summarized over here in this diagram. So you can pause the video and have a look at some of the major events that are occurring there. But as a summary, our input of pyruvate is causing an output of carbon dioxide, an output of ATP, and more of an output of NADH. Now, the output of NADH that's in glycolysis and Krebs cycle is going to be an input in the electron transport chain. So the electron transport chain is occurring in that cristae of the mitochondria. Okay, and it's basically a series of enzyme complexes that we call accepting electrons from the NADH and also what we call FADH2, and this is how the energy is going to be passed along. Okay, so you might be familiar with this diagram here or seen it before. This is basically reduced when they accept electrons, and it's oxidized when they pass them on. So there's a lot of redox reactions occurring, but basically it's an input of NADH molecules and the requirement of oxygen. We've got 6 oxygen molecules forming 6 water molecules, but our major output here is 32 or 34 ATP. Okay, and this is the important big output of ATP that is happening, okay, in the electron transport chain. So if we're looking at it overall, cellular respiration, our mass production of ATP is actually happening in this final stage. Anaerobic respiration, if we just stop it after glucose, there is ATP being produced, but only 2. Okay, so it's not going to be as efficient in producing ATP as it would be if aerobic respiration was happening. In terms of non-oxygen, we call that anaerobic respiration. Okay, and this occurs in the cytosol of the cell, so that glycolysis stage, and no mitochondria are required, no oxygen is required, but it still requires that input of glucose to produce that ATP. Basically, in anaerobic respiration, there's going to be a different biochemical pathway that's happening after glycolysis, and that's basically using molecules other than oxygen as those final electron acceptors. So a lot of prokaryotes, things like bacteria, have evolved many anaerobic pathways themselves. In eukaryotes, though, we have what we call alcohol fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. So if we look at alcohol fermentation, it's basically the energy from the NADH is going to be used to recombine pyruvate molecules into water, with water to form some alcohol or ethanol molecules, okay? This occurs in yeast and winemaking and bread making. So in terms of alcohol fermentation, we're producing carbon dioxide and we're producing ethanol, okay? Looking at lactic acid fermentation, this is what we call animal fermentation. And basically, instead of the pyruvate molecules being turned into ethanol and carbon dioxide, they're recombined to form lactic acid. Okay, and that might, if you've been on a really long run, you might find like your muscles cramping. That's because of the buildup of lactic acid as well. So we're using oxygen faster than our body's being able to create it. That can also form what we call that anaerobic state. So our muscle cells do this if no oxygen is available to them, but it can be problematic because it's going to lower the pH of the cell. So it can't really be kept up for too long. And this is sort of the equation that we can write here for that. But overall, anaerobic respiration is going to end up producing 2 ATP per 1 molecule of glucose. Whereas aerobic respiration is going to produce 36 ATP per molecule of glucose. So aerobic is definitely much more efficient, but anaerobic yields a lot faster because it's just undergoing that glycolysis. So if a cell really needs energy really quickly, then anaerobic is best, but it's not feasible for long term. All right, and then last but not least, the factors that might affect the rate of respiration from occurring. So the big things that we're going to look at here are temperature, glucose availability, and oxygen, and they can be summarized by this graph over here. So if we look at temperature, basically as our temperature increases, we're going to increase our rate of respiration from occurring. We get to our optimal, and then that is going to decline because of that enzyme denaturing. In terms of pH, okay, kind of like what we were looking at in a previous video with enzyme function. If it's too low or too high, above or below the optimum pH, that enzyme is denatured, therefore rate of respiration is going to be lower. So it's going to be the best at its optimal pH. In terms of glucose or oxygen concentration, basically, initially, it's going to increase the rate of reaction, but eventually, it's going to sort of plateau a little bit as that substrate concentration continues to increase. The rate of reaction will kind of stabilize. All right. And inhibitors. Okay, so depending on the type of inhibitor, they'll have a different impact on the rate of reaction, but they'll most likely plateau as well. Like I said at the start of the video, this was more of a summary. There is another in-depth video if you look at the previous study design and go to the cellular respiration video there is a little bit more there, but otherwise these are designed as a summary. But if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below and I will have a look at them and reply to what I can. Thank you very much. Bye.